I mean, the scribes are often the bad guys in the New Testament, right? They're often sort of the Jesus nemesis, right? And in this reading, I'm certainly trying to position this as a wise and learned and creative appropriation of the prophetic traditions of the day of the Lord, one that holds out hope for a new age, but does so by authorizing a stance of criticism, authorizing a stance of, criticism about attempted realizations of it, right? That, I think, is an attitude that religious people should always kind of foster, an attitude of engaging their traditions, engaging their scriptures, engaging their texts, maintaining the hopes, but also thinking critically about how those hopes interface with present day politics or not. And as a scholar, I don't, point it out to say like one side is right or one side is wrong, but I do want to inculcate, as you say, a respect and ask what we can learn from these scribal modes of exegesis and reading. And certainly not just think of them as sort of the bad guys, which a superficial reading of the Gospels might incline interpreters towards.
Hello and welcome to It Means What It Means, the podcast in which a guy with some college and a day job has long-form conversations about biblical texts. Today's guest is David DeJong, and I'm trying to do this thing where my opinions and more thoughts that I have get put into the outro of the episode, so you get a chance to kind of go in without me, gumming up your brain with my opinions. So feel free to skip through to that and, I encourage you to listen to the preview for next week's episode. If you do skip through my thoughts, I won't take it personally because I won't know. But I will say in advance of this episode, journal articles are not only just statistically the most prominent episodes in this podcast and will continue to be, partly because I'm a slow reader and 20 pages is a lot easier for me to work through than, upwards of 200, but actually more because that's where people flesh out ideas. And to the extent that this podcast is having an effect on me, personally, intellectually, spiritually, emotionally, even, articles like this are really important. They are foundational. So yeah, for the podcast, it's easy to get a hold of. Also, they include the email address. Books don't always do that, so I guess that's the third reason. But the part where there's important work being done in articles, and I'm learning to look into a lot of journals out there, because that's where I'm going to find younger scholars who are doing new work. They're bringing new life into biblical studies, and I imagine a lot of other disciplines. And so, I think the long form conversation part of this podcast to me is probably more essential than the biblical texts part. So, at this point, you've already seen I've had a fantasy author on here. I don't intend to stop doing that. I've had historians, classicists, and I'm going to keep doing that. I'm going to keep trying to expand the area that I cover in this podcast. So that said, if you want to support the podcast, subscribe wherever you are, rate, review, do all of that. If you want to know more about what's going on with the podcast, my interaction with social media is mainly about letting you know what's coming up, episodes that I've recorded, books maybe that I'm getting, but you can follow on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, Blue Sky, Spoutable, TikTok, Threads. If there's a social media network out there, we're on it. You can also subscribe on YouTube, where I post promotional videos. And if you want to go one step farther, there's also Patreon. So for $5 a month, you get episodes 10 days before they come out for free. And you can also get video in addition to the full audio episodes. So if that's something you want to see the ever-changing state of my books back here. I think it's probably going to stay the same, but that's, yeah, if you're listening right now, you don't know what I'm talking about. Or you want to, see the changes that I've undergone facial hair wise. $5 a month will get you that, and I'm looking for other ways to provide some kind of benefit or additional resources to people who subscribe. I'd love to hear your feedback on guest suggestions. Maybe changes in approach to conversation. I'm open to that. I'm pretty happy with the way that I engage with guests. But if there's something you'd like to hear me do differently, I would definitely love to know what that is, and maybe I can at least consider it. That said, here is my conversation with David DeJong. Enjoy. David DeJong, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Before we get going, will you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I'm an assistant professor of biblical studies at Hope College in Holland, Michigan. And I do work in ancient Judaism, mostly on the reception history of the Hebrew Bible, in Jewish and New Testament texts, early Christian texts. So my book was on the prophet like Moses, which is a passage in Deuteronomy where Moses promises that a prophet will arise like him from among the Israelites. And I looked at both eschatological and non-eschatological interpretations of that promise in Judaism and Christianity and the Hebrew Bible going forward, which also became important for Christian reflection on Jesus. Following my PhD at Notre Dame, I spent some time at St. Louis University teaching there, and now I've been at Hope College for 5 years, and I continue to work on reception and reflection on prophetic figures, which also prompted this article on Elijah.
So this article being the Anti-Eschatological Elijah and the reinterpretation of the day of, we'll say, Adonai, in Malachi 3:23 through 24. So I was thinking about it this morning before we got on here. I think I'll do a rundown of hey, here's broadly speaking what eschatology is, because I really do want you to be able to jump into what you're talking about. I prefer to let guests state what they're stating rather than having to take a lot of time to go against the point that they're going against. Feel free to do that however you want, but you don't have the burden to define eschatology for a general audience. So first question I sent you, would you please start us off by explaining what the day of Adonai is and how, and I know I said how your view differs, but what is your view of the day of Adonai represented in Malachi 3:23 through 24?
Yeah, thanks for that question. It's a good question just to get the ball rolling here. So the day of Adonai, or the day of the Lord, is this concept that we find in the prophetic literature. I think it occurs 16 times in the prophets, from Amos through Malachi. It's very debated by scholars as to where this concept comes from. Some rooted in holy war traditions, some rooted in cultic language. It's not invented by the prophets, but it's appropriated by the prophets in really creative ways. The best guess, the best theory seems to be that the day of the Lord, the day of Adonai, is a day in which they are waiting for God to come to vindicate his people against evil oppressors. And it's a day of deliverance. It's a day of then celebration and victory. One can think of Deuteronomy. The book of Deuteronomy associates Pesach, or the Passover, with the liberation from Egypt, right? And so one can think of Adonai coming to bring judgment on the oppressor and deliver God's people. It's originally used for specific events within history. Amos inverts it and says, you think the day of Adonai is a day of celebration, but in fact, the divine warrior is coming against you with the Assyrian invasion. And so he inverts it into a day of judgment against Israel in the northern kingdom with the coming of the Assyrian Empire. And so it becomes a sense of, religious festival, day of celebration, but also day of judgment. the divine warrior is coming to judge his people, and it's associated with these specific calamities: the Assyrian invasion in the 8th century BC, the Babylonian invasion in the 6th century BC. In later apocalyptic and prophetic texts, it increasingly acquires a more cosmic sense of, the end of history itself, or the culmination of history. And that's kind of a move from the prophetic sense of like a specific disaster within history to something that's beyond that, in very sort of in a striking way, a more cosmic conflagration, if you will. My own view is that, I think Malachi is part of that later kind of trajectory, in dialogue with texts like Joel, which is also in that later trajectory of seeing the day of Yahweh in more cosmic terms. It doesn't really differ from this standard view of the day of the Lord, uh, other than to say that I think what's happened later on is, especially in dialogue with or in influence of apocalyptic type circles, you get timetables, you get the sense of a script that needs to be followed. What is the playbook? What is going to happen? Um, and especially in Joel and Malachi, you get the sense of a possible return of prophecy before the great and terrible day of the Lord. And uh, that return of prophecy as part of sort of a divine timetable is the thing that I'm interested in. So my view is really exploring how this idea of a timetable and precursors and prerequisites emerge, and what that says about those who are kind of putting forward these prerequisites.
Okay, so specifically Malachi 3:23 and 24, where do they fit into this?
Yeah, so specifically Malachi 3:20, 3:24, we get this really striking innovation in ancient Judaism, which is this idea that Elijah is a figure not only of the past, but now also of the future. It says, "Behold, I will send the prophet Elijah before the great and terrible day of the Lord." And where did this come from? We know that, there are these traditions about Elijah, that he ascended into heaven. So you can imagine that, then somebody would have thought of him as potentially not being able to come back. But why? Why this tradition that Elijah is a figure not only of the past, but also of the future? Um, and so I'm arguing, so this consensus position has been that this is a product of really heightened eschatological expectation, that this is a part of sort of a messianic fervor uh, in the editing of the prophetic books, uh, typically dated around, 250 BC in the Hellenistic period or so. And I'm arguing actually that the reverse is the case, that if you want to say first X and then Y, where Y is the day of the Lord and X is something that needs to happen before that, you're saying there's a prerequisite, then what you're doing is you're actually deferring the day of the Lord. You're pushing it off. You're saying, no, we can't have the day of the Lord yet because Elijah needs to come first. So my argument is deceptively simple, I guess. It's the anti-eschatological Elijah, because I argue that the scribal authors of this conclusion to Malachi are actually pushing off eschatological enthusiasm for the day of Yahweh by establishing a prerequisite which they themselves have to verify. Elijah has to return first, before the day of Yahweh can come. And I think this is part of broader tensions in Persian and Hellenistic era Judaism, in which different groups of literate scribal elite are having theological debates about, what does the future hold? What does it look like? When will Israel's restoration come, and how, and why, and under what terms, and so on?
So I guess two things, and you can answer them however you like. Did you coin the term anti-eschatological? And then what does it look like on the ground for, I guess, scribal schools or factions to be warring it out in the text?
Yeah, did I coin the term? I think, maybe I did. I don't know. I haven't done like the Google search to check.
I like that.
It
Yeah,
was
I like
it,
that. Be careful.
it was deliberately somewhat provocative, and so I'm glad it grabbed your attention, because that was sort of the goal of anti-eschatological. I think I've given paper versions of this at conferences where, I had a kind of a more bland title. And, as I worked on it and I pushed the thesis further and further, I thought, I want to go with anti-eschatological to sort of pique the interest. Because eschatological Elijah is kind of a standard concept, especially in New Testament and early Christianity, but also in the Dead Sea Scrolls and some sectors within Second Temple Judaism. The idea that Elijah is coming back as an eschatological figure is well attested. So to create this notion of, well, the origin of this tradition is actually anti-eschatological is pretty striking. Um, uh, so, yeah, I think I did coin the term, but we do have other texts that I think are coming from the same worldview or milieu. Ben Sira, many scholars have argued that Ben Sira is anti-eschatological or non-eschatological in his outlook. I don't know if they've used that phrase, but they sort of highlighted the lack of focus on individual eschatology or afterlife, and the downplaying of concerns for future restoration in Ben Sira. Otto Pluger, a German scholar from the previous century, very influentially argued that First and Second Chronicles was non-eschatological in its outlook. So, it didn't use the phrase anti-eschatological, but used non-eschatological. And so there are other texts operating in this sort of, I think, mode or register, in dialogue with, perhaps opposed to, movements such as gave rise to the Book of Daniel. So I think what I'm interested in exploring, and part of this is invariably speculative, but we've had a number of scholars look at the kind of final versions of the prophetic books that we have, Isaiah and the Book of the 12 and so on, and seeing late editing reflecting emerging sectarian tendencies within Judaism. And then we have sort of, the emergence of actual different parties, Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, and so on, in the 2nd century BC. And we don't have a very clear idea or conceptual map of the precursor for those parties, what things were like in the 3rd and 4th century BC. But we can see when we look at Isaiah and some of these other texts that there are different movements kind of already emerging, different theological trajectories. And so, my hypothesis then, which is admittedly speculative, and anytime we're dealing with sort of these editing of the prophetic text in the Hebrew Bible, we don't have somebody saying, like, I'm the author and putting up their hand. We have to kind of engage in sort of the best case we can make. But I'm seeing sort of the end of Malachi coming from a non-eschatological or anti-eschatological view, very similar to the circles that produced Chronicles, and very similar to Ben Sira's later perspective.
So, I mean, it is kind of a, hey, this thing is going to happen, but it's not part of the ultimate thing that's going to happen. Is that what you're saying?
The day of Yahweh?
Well, no, like the Elijah portion of it.
Yeah, it is a sense of, hey, prophecy will come back. This was already promised in Joel, right? So you get the famous text in Joel 2 about the pouring out of the Spirit on all flesh, and the relativizing of social distinctions in the outpouring of an eschatological prophetic gift. And that, again, seems to be a product of, I would say, greater eschatological enthusiasm and kind of inciting more sort of imminent sort of hopes, including the sort of eradication of certain social distinctives. I think counterbalancing that, you get the, okay, we'll look for a return of prophecy, a return of the Spirit of the Lord, before the final days, before the final intervention of Yahweh in history. But it's not going to be this democratizing, more egalitarian, to use that language, bestowal. It's going to be a venerated figure from the ancient past who is represented in the texts over which we, the scribes, have the interpretive control, and whom we will recognize. Um, and that represents a compromise of a sort, a compromise with the more uh, eschatological movements, but also a compromise that retains a certain priestly scribal prerogative to interpret the signs of the times and sort of make the call as to when is this thing happening.
So, and you mentioned it talking here today, but you also mentioned some New Testament passages in the article.
Mm-hmm.
And so, does this explain why? Was it Matthew 16? Jesus goes to the disciples and says, "Who do the people say that I am?" Well, some of them say you're Elijah. So that okay. Just so I know that I'm kind of situating this properly. That idea that Jesus or John the Baptist or some other figure is Elijah, would that be perceived by the people who are hearing it or thinking it? Would that be understood as, oh, it's the beginning, or the transition has begun, prophecy is back, as opposed to, oh, no, this is, well, would that Elijah returning also be a messianic figure? Because that's another thing that comes up in the article. I know that's all over the place. Do your best. There were several interrogative sentences in there that I don't know how to answer, how you're going to answer all at once. But
Yeah, I think that, I think you're right on the right path there, that, the New Testament evidence, we can't say that there was one definitive set of messianic expectations in the first century CE. They were kind of varied and amorphous, and there was a wide set of messianic expectations. But certainly we do see in the Dead Sea Scrolls and the New Testament, this sense of a returning Elijah. Now, is that Elijah himself, as Malachi seems to say, or is it the spirit of Elijah in another figure? All these things are being kind of argued out and debated. Um, I think in Mark 9, which is the earliest sense of this in the New Testament, you get Jesus speaking about the resurrection of the dead, and then the disciples are confused and they say, why do the scribes say that Elijah must come first? And there were two things that really interested me about that question, and it kind of put me on this thesis as well, is that the disciples, they don't say, well, why does Malachi the prophet say that Elijah must come first? Or why does the scripture say that Elijah must come first? They ask, why do the scribes say this? All right. And then the second part of that question that interested me was that word must, or day in Greek, that this is necessary. This is a part of the timetable that the scribes are kind of exercising some interpretive control over. So you could imagine Jesus' disciples as sort of these, um, enthusiastic about the overthrow of the empire, the coming of the messianic kingdom, and so on, and sort of being restrained in their zeal by the elite, who are saying, look, Elijah needs to come first. And that's how they're encountering this teaching, rather than knowing Malachi themselves and encountering it that way. So I think we do have this resurgence of interest in Elijah in the first century CE, which is remarkable. It's kind of this explosion of interest in Elijah. Why do we have that? It's in all the Gospels. It's in other Jewish texts as well. And part of it is just the overall sort of agitation and messianic turmoil of the time period. And Elijah becomes a figure that's associated in various ways with these hopes, these expectations, and so on.
okay, so again, I have multiple things to throw at you, and one of them, I'll bring this up first because I just want it out there in the hopes that if it doesn't get answered right now, at least both of us will know, and we can maybe try to come back to it.
Mhm.
I think it may have been Richard Horsley that years ago first exposed me to the idea that there were royal, prophetic, and priestly components of messianism.
Mhm.
And if if you're like, nope, not really my bag, I'll find somebody else. Maybe I'll hunt him down. But the other part is, so the scribes say, which indicates a contribution other than just rote copying. Just like your responsibility as a scribe is to, aleph, like to copy exactly what's on the page. That there is maybe a more permissive or cooperative approach to the transmission of biblical texts. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, so I mean, we'll start with I guess the latter point. The scribes as kind of teachers, the scribes as kind of um, negotiating the tradition. I mean, certainly scribes are copying texts, and at a certain point, these prophetic texts do get fixed, and there's a more conservative attitude towards them. I mean, for a long time, for centuries, perhaps these prophetic texts are sort of like a rolling snowball. We can see this clearly with Jeremiah and the Hebrew version versus the Septuagint version, and the accretions over time. Um, so we do have a sense of kind of a long period where you know scribal annotations or commentary would be incorporated into the main text. But yeah, the texts do become fixed in the scribal sense with respect to the scripture. Then is more mediating it or passing it down. Um, but nevertheless, I mean, if you are in a largely illiterate society, um, and I use this example with my students all the time, like if I am teaching my students, and because uh, I say, only 3% of the people in the society are literate, or 5%, and because I have the PhD, it gets to be me. So none of you can read, right? So that means that they really have to trust what the scribes are saying and how they're explaining these. The written texts are not. Uh, they contain their authority. They're reposits of kind of authoritative instruction, but they're not accessible or available except to the scribes. So there really is that kind of link between kind of a fluidity between the scribe who knows the text and copies the text, but also teaches the texts and explains them to the people. Um, and we definitely get movements in Second Temple Judaism later on that are more revered in terms of their handling and interpretation of the text. Josephus will tell us that the Pharisees were, regarded as the most exact and precise and the most revered interpreters of the law, right? So you definitely get a sense of uh, uh, those among the literate elite perhaps building followings and being having their authority tied to their understanding of what is written. The first part about Horsley, yeah, I mean, I think Richard Horsley's work is still very important. I mean, I think that when you read Richard Horsley's work, you again get a sense of the dynamism of the period and sort of the excitement in the air. I mean, he has a theory about Elijah being important too that is a bit more speculative. That is, Jesus as Elijah is sort of like Elijah and Elisha, his successor, are these great prophets in the north in Israel, and they're charismatic, wonder-working prophets, as opposed to sort of the southern Judean prophetic tradition where you don't really see miracles or healings. And so, his theory is that sort of Jesus is kind of coming from the north and reviving that uh, that tradition of wonder working prophecy, calling to mind Elijah and Elijah. Uh, he doesn't really ascribe much significance to this text from Malachi in terms of eschatological thinking. And so it definitely is more for him. His work is really, really great, and he highlights the sociological dynamics at play. But it is all about like sociology and not as much about like scriptural interpretation or reception history. And I'm trying to say, I suppose, why not both?
Yeah, for sure. Why not? I think though, I don't know. In my lifetime, the royal aspect at least for Christians, evangelical Christians in America, that has been the dominant understanding of what Messiah is. But essentially, this figure of an anointed one, it could be either of or any of those three that we're talking about. And throughout the New Testament, there are, I mean, you just pointed to in the Gospels for sure, there are representations of Jesus as prophetic, and then there are genealogies and things like that that point to the royal. But then you have, you know what, I can't think of anything necessarily in the Gospels, but for sure in Hebrews, a kind of a priestly representation. And so there was a diversity of emphasis, I suppose, within Judaism as it was developing around what a messianic figure is. Is that what we're seeing here in Malachi? Because again, the language was brought up in the article. Is this here talking about a messianic figure, or is a messianic figure only eschatological?
Yeah, that's a good question. I suppose, it is talking about a messianic figure understood more broadly. Um, at the time of first century BC, first century CE, yeah, you have the Qumran community hoping for a Messiah of Aaron and a Messiah of David. So you have a priestly Messiah and a Davidic Messiah as sort of focus, and they do hold out for coming of a prophet as well. Now, who is that prophet, and how does he relate to the other two messiahs? Um, it's not entirely clear. Um, so certainly, there have been those who have made the argument that Elijah is the priestly Messiah, and Elijah. There's a story about Elijah. He builds the altar on Mount Carmel. He does some priestly type things. You also have associations of Elijah with Phinehas in Numbers 25. Phinehas is a priest, and he acts with zeal, and he engages in religious violence and to protect Israel from apostasy. So you do get interpreters developing explicit connections between Phinehas in Numbers 25, Elijah in 1 Kings 17, and then, is the future Elijah going to come back and also turn Israel away from apostasy and back to the worship of Adonai and so on? So there are these interesting exegetical speculations going on all throughout Second Temple Judaism, and different authors are making different links. For sure, is Elijah the priest? Is he the prophet? Is he the royal Messiah himself? And are the royal and prophetic messiahs combined in some way, as we see in John's gospel, or are royal and priestly messiahs distinct figures? Again, there is no one template, so what we have is considerable exegetical freedom and creativity, and really a drawing on the repertoire of prophetic symbolism, imagery, expectations, in order to create, a variety of sort of hopes, eschatological hopes, because they are, eschatological, about the future. They often can remain kind of amorphous and broad in their visions, and then when you have a realized eschatology, that's when you sort of need to kind of pin it down a little more and be more precise about, well, what is the Messiah actually? And that's a big project that we see in the New Testament. Then is, okay, now we have a realized eschatology. We have somebody who's we actually say is Messiah. So what does that mean, and how do we reinterpret it so that this idea can include suffering and death and all of these things? As long as the eschatological hopes are sort of unrealized and out there, there's a lot you can sort of throw at the wall, and a lot of images and connections to past figures. Melchizedek, I didn't mention, he comes in a lot as well, and Enoch, and so there's just this wide array of biblical figures text traditions are drawing on as they speculate eschatologically.
So you did mention there might be a difference between the Hebrew tradition in the text and how the same passage appears in Septuagint.
Mhm.
Is that relevant to Malachi 3?
There is a difference, yeah, in the Hebrew tradition or Masoretic text has this promise of Elijah last at the end of the text. And Septuagint puts it first, and then the call to observe the law of Moses, the Torah of Moses, is at the end of Malachi in Septuagint. Um, I don't know whether that is significant. Some have argued that's significant for sort of the original context, and whether the group that added the Elijah piece is the same as the group that added the Moses piece. So it's been a very sort of, I wouldn't say popular, because this is all sort of niche biblical scholarship, but there's been an influential argument in more kind of niche biblical scholarship about, well, maybe these are two separate editions, and there's the appeal to observe the law of Moses, the Torah of Moses, which commanded at Horeb before all Israel. That is the sort of non-eschatological sort of keep the law. And then the later editors are like, I'm going to send Elijah, and that's the eschatological movement. And so one scholar called this sort of like a hybrid of pragmatism and apocalyptic visionary sort of hopes. And I point out in my article that seems like a really kind of a strange hybrid. So maybe we could think about this differently. Maybe these do belong together. Elijah is seen as a new Moses. Elijah and Moses belong together, and the idea is we have to, for the present, keep the Torah, focus on the Torah of Moses. That's what's normative in the present times, and we're reserving the eschatological hope for the far-off future, including Elijah. So I'm seeing these two pieces as part of the same worldview and produced by the same group. Why do we have differences? I think part of it is just this end, the word in the Hebrew text, it ends with the word cherem, lest I come and strike the land with a curse. Cherem, that's the word that's used for the genocide of the Canaanites in the Hebrew Bible. It brings up sort of horrific allusions or resonances. So ending on that note of, if Elijah fails in his mission and Yahweh has to come, it might be really bad. That's kind of a depressing note on which to end. So I see the Greek tradition as ending on the more positive note, and probably then the Hebrew text as primary, although it's hard to say, and scholars have made a case for either one being coming first and coming second. My argument doesn't really hinge on that, but it does see these as part of the same anti-eschatological worldview, one that is about sort of deferring the day of the Lord and focusing on the normative role of the law of Moses in the present.
Is there any evidence in the interpretive record? So we'll say kind of groups alongside the formulation of early Jesus followers. Do we see things that kind of represent the idea that you're talking about here? And it's okay if you're like, I don't know, or pass.
The idea of deferral of eschatology, or
yeah. Sorry, this is one I'm having trouble wrapping my head around how I want to put the words. I think, well, because okay, so there are revolutionary Jewish movements that are obviously, much like early Jesus followers, they are articulating an eschatological vision. And then there are other movements that don't necessarily have a messianic figure that they center around. And so are they looking at it as a deferral of eschatology?
it's hard to know. I mean, you have, obviously, in the New Testament, you do have the Sadducees represented as pushing back against eschatological expectations in a way that I think would align with the perspective of First and Second Chronicles or Ben Sira or the conclusion of Malachi, as I've argued. But they might be pushing back even more robustly not sort of integrating it as the conclusion of Malachi does, right? So I think, an older concept in New Testament scholarship, and one that I think is still relevant and probably needs to be integrated more robustly into a Jewish context, is this concept of the delay of the parousia. So the delay of the parousia is this idea that the earliest New Testament texts are really kind of have this sense that Jesus is coming back very soon. Like, well, we are alive, Paul says, and Mark's gospel. You know, this generation will not pass away until all these things are accomplished. And you do get that sense of delay or of modification of the eschatological timetable in Matthew and in Luke Acts, and especially in Second Peter. And I think what we do have there is sort of a recapitulation of a sociological process that we see in ancient Judaism a number of times, where there's kind of this worry about eschatological delay, and we have it in the Pesher Habakkuk from Qumran, and then a sense that the secrets of the prophets have been entrusted to an authorized interpreter who can tell you what these texts actually mean, and so don't worry about the delay. The authorized interpreter, whether that be the righteous teacher from Qumran or the apostles in early Christian understanding, they will sort of interpret the texts and give you the new key, so that we can understand why history is kind of taking longer than it should. That is a dynamic that we see repeat itself over and over again, actually, throughout Jewish and Christian history. So I think we see it in these foundational texts and movements, but we also see it in more recent messianic type movements, or uh, denominations offshoots that attempt to sort of specify when is the end of the world happening, and then attempt to always kind of reinterpret, especially when expectations meet reality, and don't come to fruition in the way they would have hoped.
So I glanced at my questions and I did see one that I was kind of excited when it popped into my head. And I can't point to a specific place in the article that made me think of this. So bear with me here. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but I don't know, like 20 years ago, Diarmaid MacCulloch's The Reformation of History came out. And I was re-listening to it last year to the audiobook. And something that hadn't stood out to me this time. And it's this idea that really up until the Reformation started, there was this idea about history that it was, as we moved forward, it was deteriorating. And then an idea came along kind of after that. And there's a lot there as an understanding of history. And I can't point to the exact passage when I was reading that made me think of this. Is that conceptually something that exists in the minds of the people who are building and transmitting biblical texts?
I think it's there, again, in some groups, but again, this needs to be always counterbalanced with texts that look for really radical hopes, and how they saw these things, how they saw newness versus sort of the prestige of antiquity, sort of dialoguing with each other, is can be difficult to parse out. You're certainly right that, especially in the groups that developed kind of a clear periodization of history, or kind of like a clear sense of like a timetable, which seems to have been something apocalyptic groups were particularly invested in. But priestly interpreters in general were very interested in chronology, and how long did people live, and what is the periodization of history, and what era of history are we in now. Um, Josephus is very interested in this, and Jubilees, the Book of Jubilees, and many priestly movements. So I think I think you're right that that worldview comes through, especially when you consider that, the genealogies in Genesis 5 and Genesis 11. You have this sense of people living up to 1,000 years, like people living really on this gradual decline, so that our kind of present lifespans are sort of a cursed and meager existence compared to the lifespan of the ancients. Um, that is a very striking worldview, and it's probably hard for us to appreciate the difference between that worldview and our modern scientific and technological worldview, in which everything is always getting better, and we certainly can't imagine thinking about the past that way. I don't know that, how much harmonizing I can do with these traditions and assume that, that's also a part of the view of the priestly authors of Malachi. Um, we do get other texts that are looking for, you know, a new thing. See, I'm doing a new thing in Second Isaiah, and when the new thing happens, you're going to forget the former things. You're not going to worry about the former things. Um, in Jeremiah, you get the promise of a new covenant, which is really basically the old covenant. So this kind of rhetoric of newness and oldness it's being carefully calibrated, and it's being debated in ancient Judaism. Now, the new covenant is the old Torah, but it's written on the heart, a kind of a memorized Torah that the people will then be able to truly kind of follow. So, yeah, I mean, the new covenant looks very conservative, right? But you get Ezekiel and the radical vision of dry bones, and you get all kinds of hopes for newness and restoration, but also kind of a strong sense that antiquity is best. And the appeal to antiquity is the appeal to kind of authoritative traditions, um, and sometimes in the same author. So yeah, it is there's a kind of a careful rhetoric being calibrated and debated among ancient Jewish authors.
Okay.
I don't know
So,
if I nuanced that too much for you, or
no, no. I just and it's I apologize if it comes across like I'm trying to shoehorn that in. I just yeah, that seems like a really big deal. And you're only the like you're I don't know if this is praise or if it's just a comment, but Hindi Nyman made me think of that too. And I asked, and I think it may just be a question that the answer is too nuanced as it applies to biblical studies, because I mean the picture can be it can get clearer in some ways with new sources, but it's not talking about 16th century history. We have a much clearer picture of 16th century history, right?
well, I mean, Hindi Nyman's work is very interesting in terms of that assumption, right? Because this whole development of pseudepigraphal works and what is the, I mean, what are some of the worldviews behind, associating works with Enoch and with Moses and with, I mean, one thing to sort of keep in mind is that, Judaism at the time of Jesus or before the time of Jesus, a lot of people are not assuming, if you say Moses wrote 5 books, a lot of people are assuming Moses wrote a lot more than 5 books. What are you talking about, right? Like even the Pentateuch is a contested idea. And what's in the air there is sort of the prestige of antiquity, and we have the Assumption of Moses and the Testament of Moses and the Book of Jubilees and all these other Mosaic traditions that were influential, and then we got this Enoch guy who wrote a whole bunch of stuff, right? So one thing that we have is we do have a sense of sort of the publicly received scriptures, which there's no canon yet. They're not defined. It's not strictly demarcated, but certainly Torah and prophets are important to that. And then we have a sense of a broad literature that different groups are drawing on different traditions, some more than others, and that a lot of these texts are essentially interpretive. They're they're appealing to antiquity. They're definitely appealing to the authority of great figures from antiquity, but they're also attempting to inhabit that tradition today. And maybe these appeals to Moses and Elijah at the end of Malachi are just a part of that broader sense of an appeal to antiquity um, that has to sort of be relevant today in our moment, in our time. Um, there's something very kind of attractive about that idea of situating even these sort of texts in light with these broader developments. Why did pseudepigrapha emerge? Why do we get this kind of flourishing literature that's very interpretive and very focused on what does it mean to inhabit these traditions and keep them alive for our age?
Well, I mean, you guys have your work cut out for you. Those of you who get paid to look into those whys. So I'll be here to hear what you have to say on that.
Yeah, we do for sure. And many times, as in this article, I mean, there's an amount of speculation involved, and we want pushback as well, because we're trying to put the best case forward, the case that has convinced us as to where these texts are coming from, but especially with the Hebrew Bible, and to a lesser degree the New Testament. These texts are edited and re-edited, and um, you can't be sure of your thesis about what scribal group it was and what their view on the restoration of Israel or not was. But what you can try to do is try to illuminate these dynamics that do become incredibly important for the formation of rabbinic Judaism and early Christianity as kind of coming out of uh, the diverse and contested and turbulent world of Second Temple Judaism.
Yeah, that's fair. Good luck with that. Was there anything in the article that you were hoping I would ask about that has not come up yet today?
I don't know that. Let's see. I'm trying to think about what I covered in the article and what I would like to emphasize about the argument. Um, I think again, I'm not really trying to sort of reinvent the wheel here. I'm just sort of, it is maybe a new argument, but it's a reformulation of points that have been made. But this basic notion that um, the end of Malachi can be put in conversation and perhaps as a critique of something like Daniel 9, which does see the 70 weeks is the passage about the 70 weeks of years. And, at the culmination of the 70 weeks of years is going to be sort of the culmination of history. This reinterpretation of Jeremiah's understanding of the length of exile. So to see that as a view that's kind of more invested in apocalyptic timetables and very much interested in, following the timetable and when is this culmination going to come. And to see Malachi, the end of Malachi, saying, no, we need Elijah to come back first, as sort of a repudiation of that, I think it's a thesis about the eschatological Elijah and the origin of returning Elijah traditions that I hope gets a hearing. I don't know that it will convince everyone, but I hope it gets a hearing. And I think, it creates an interesting dialogue even within biblical texts. I guess I would like to follow up with more work on Daniel. Daniel is this revered prophet in Second Temple Judaism. Everybody regards him as a prophet and the greatest of prophets. Josephus thinks he's wonderful, and yet in the rabbinic tradition, he's not in the prophetic canon. He's in the writings, and so again, I think somewhat speculatively, we have a bit of a demotion of Daniel there, and a bit of a anti-eschatological perspective, where the documents that are seen as maybe more responsible for inciting some of these movements and causing these catastrophes of war against Rome, destruction of the temple, and so on, are made less central. And Malachi, which rounds off the prophetic canon and maintains the hope but defers it, is in that sort of much more delimited prophetic corpus, a small prophetic corpus, of, what we refer to as the deuteronomistic history, and then the four, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the book of the 12. That all seems to be, I think, a part of these same debates, dialogue, tensions that I'm trying to explore. So, um, yeah, I guess that's where I hope that the article provokes further conversation among scholars. Can we situate more of these texts in this, with reference to this sort of broader sociological frame of reference? Are they engaged in a debate about the future and whether we should expect it imminently or not? And then maybe what are I hope that more people will sort of look into some of the New Testament Elijah references as potentially also reflecting the influence of this debate. I suggest in my article that, it's too late. It's several centuries later, so we can't really use it as insight into the original meaning. But, we may see there the influence of, scribal interpretive practices compared to sort of maybe popular exegesis on the ground and things like that.
You mentioned, and I meant to ask you about this, but I only just now remember to get back to it. I guess blander language that you used in papers, blander than anti-eschatological. What were those blander terms?
It's a good question. I'm trying to remember the paper that I gave at SBL in 2018. I could probably look it up for you. The title of the paper. Let's see. Hope Deferred was the title of a paper version of this that I gave at SBL in 2018 in the Book of the 12 Prophets section. The paper was called Hope Deferred, the Eschatological Elijah and the Reinterpretation of the Day of the Lord in Malachi 3. So you can see there I just went with the phrase eschatological Elijah and called the paper Hope Deferred. As I was going with the phrase eschatological Elijah in most of the comments I was giving about this, and there's a place for that, but I guess I wanted to highlight the new thesis I had, which is that this is a product of sort of dampening of eschatological enthusiasm rather than a product of eschatological enthusiasm. And so it is a bit of a provocative title, but it's one that hopefully draws attention to, well, what are the social dynamics? What are the broader implications? Some have argued that this text was intended to sort of round off that corpus of Nevi'im or prophets. I don't necessarily think so, but it is interesting to think about it as part of this sort of broader sense of, we have this limited collection of prophets from the past, and that's all we need. And, some of these Enochic type figure, these texts later on that are very sort of, apocalyptic and millenarian in their expectations are demoted or removed or not included.
I think this is a helpful thesis to have out there, because a lot of, and by the time this episode comes out, the listeners hopefully will have heard me discuss some of this, but some of the particularly early Christian readings, I think, are looking to basically find in Hebrew Bible texts explanations for how what we call Judaism was just always insufficient and always pointing itself towards something better. And I think this is helpful because it's saying, no, this covenant is not bad. That there is a satisfaction with what was given in the past. Yeah, I like that. I'm not a fan. I'm whatever the opposite. Oh, I'm an enemy. I'm an enemy of anti-Semitic readings of biblical texts. I have zero love for those, and so anything that I can get my hands on that I think is an articulation of a polemic against those kinds of things, it always makes me happy. So thank you for that, whether you meant to or not. I'm a fan.
Well, yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, definitely, I'm trying to see this scribal reading. I mean, the scribes are often the bad guys in the New Testament, right? They're often sort of the Jesus nemesis, right? And in this reading, I'm certainly trying to position this as a wise and learned and creative appropriation of the prophetic traditions of the day of the Lord, one that holds out hope for a new age, but does so by authorizing a stance of criticism, authorizing a stance of uh, criticism about attempted realizations of it. Right. That I think is an attitude um, that religious people should always kind of foster an attitude of um, engaging their traditions, engaging their scriptures, engaging their texts, maintaining the hopes, but also thinking critically about how those hopes interface with present day politics or not. So certainly we get this long history in Christian traditions that um, especially the Book of Revelation, um, and kind of popular interpreters is always applied to like the immediate crisis, the immediate political figure, and so on. And you get these popular TV preachers that are reading the beast as you know
Saddam
communist
Hussein.
Russia or so on, or Saddam Hussein, or all the way through, and you know that's there, and you can't eradicate that from the tradition because it is there in texts like Daniel and Revelation and so on. It is going to generate those kind of readings. Although I think we need to have a more sophisticated hermeneutic with respect to apocalyptic and what it's doing, and that might help us with push back against those readings. But it is also helpful, I think, to highlight then the um, you know the scribes who you could compare to more sort of in a Christian analogy, sort of mainline traditions. Mainline Protestant traditions definitely don't emphasize that sort of imminent eschatology nearly as much, and they seem more like the sort of scribes, if you will, of Malachi 3, who are like, yeah, that will maintain the hope, but that's deferred. Um, so this tension characterizes, I think, interpretation, exegesis, engagement with these texts all the way going forward. And as a scholar, I don't, point it out to say like one side is right or one side is wrong. But I do want to inculcate, as you say, respect and ask what we can learn from these scribal modes of exegesis and reading. And certainly not just think of them as sort of the bad guys, which a superficial reading of the Gospels might incline interpreters towards.
So, what would you recommend that listeners read, listen to, watch, or any other way that they could take in information to learn more about Day of the Lord, Malachi in general, Hebrew Bible in general, um, anything that you're discussing in this article, or just that you're interested in?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, there's so many fascinating works out there that I depend on in terms of the sort of later development of prophetic text in the Hebrew Bible, and then that transition to apocalyptic. Um, some scholars that have been really important now deceased, Joseph Blankenship, an amazing scholar from the 20th century, um, Paul David Hansen, who wrote The Dawn of Apocalyptic, taught for many years at Harvard Divinity School, Otto Ploger, who I mentioned earlier. Those are kind of foundational figures, and I think it's good for people to go back and read some of the older works from the 1970s, 1980s, and get a sense of where these things came from. Today, there's also, the sort of the dean of apocalyptic studies and Second Temple interpretation, John Collins at Yale, and he's written a number of books that are also more popular on what apocalyptic is and how to understand it. Um, Anathia Portier Young has a wonderful book Apocalypse Against Empire, which really gets into some of the dynamics of some of these texts and how they were interpreting and taking up Hebrew Bible texts. My own advisor, dissertation director at Notre Dame, James Vanderkam, is very much an expert in Second Temple Judaism, the dynamics of Second Temple Judaism, including the reception of prophecy and the emergence of apocalyptic. So, in terms of Elijah traditions as they go forward, I think one thing that can be interesting to read and look at are biographies of John the Baptist, actually, curiously enough. So I have found an interesting way into Elijah literature to look at. James McGrath wrote a biography of John the Baptist. Joel Marcus wrote a recent biography. And then these scholars are, as they're talking about John the Baptist, they are invariably bringing in everything they can find about Elijah and Second Temple Judaism and so on. So Rivka Nur wrote a biography of John the Baptist. He's a figure that is attracting a lot of attention and scholarship right now for whatever reason. And of course, early Christian texts are very ambivalent about whether John is indeed Elijah. John's gospel says no, he's not, and Matthew says yes, he is, and so there is this kind of interesting debate happening. But that is one way to sort of get into some of the texts and the traditions about eschatological Elijah and what was thought about Elijah at the time.
If you can get a hold of Amber Dillon's dissertation, that's on John the Baptist as like an intertext hermeneutic, an embodied hermeneutic. James McGrath has been on the podcast, and he recommended, within 2 hours of getting off with him, I got an email from someone who was like, hey, would you be interested in talking about my dissertation on John the Baptist? So yeah, he's the way I put it, it's nice to find out he's not just the cold open for Jesus, that there is some substance to John the Baptist. So McGrath, keep in mind, actually wrote 2 biographies of John the Baptist.
That's right. That's right. And again, one is not going to agree with everything that they encounter in there, but it's going to expose you to like a, wonderful literature and theories and then connections back to Elijah, some more than others. So, thank you for alerting me to that work, because that's another one I'll have to check out. There is a lot being done on Elijah right now, especially in New Testament studies, mostly like literary readings, like Elijah and Luke Acts is like this kind of flourishing subfield. Jeremy Ott and Jocelyn McWhirter, a number of people writing on what did they think. And I think there's a real resurgence here, which is interesting, but mostly done in the New Testament, at least, in sort of literary, narrative critical type of analyses of like, how is Elijah being portrayed in Mark or in Matthew or in Luke? And I think one thing that would be helpful would be bringing in some of these sociological perspectives as well and seeing if they shed light on who is deploying Elijah and why and to what ends. And are some of these same dynamics still relevant, even in the Gospels and New Testament times? I don't know, but my hunch is yes. Still have to work that thesis out.
Okay, last question. What do you read for fun?
For fun? Oh boy, yeah. I mean, when I have time, I do like historical fiction. Really kind of any historical fiction or fantasy literature. I read the Wolf Hall series recently, which is also now apparently a masterpiece production, BBC. It's like Oliver Cromwell and Henry VIII and Hilary Mantel wrote it, and it's wonderful. So I like getting into, when I read fiction, I like to read historical fiction about time periods I don't know enough about, whether it be the medieval period or the Reformation period or other periods, to sort of see how some of the things I'm interested in are some of these same dynamics, religious, political, other dynamics merge in other societies.
It's all connected,
It's
man.
all connected. It's all connected. It is fascinating. I mean,
What you
the Reformation
mentioned
historian
fantasy
earlier.
literature. I'm sorry, what's that?
You mentioned the Reformation historian earlier, and it's all
Yeah.
connected for sure. Yeah.
You mentioned fantasy literature. Any fantasy in particular?
Um, I guess the most recent series I read, I was actually kind of disappointed by. So, and a number of these authors
Yeah,
don't.
you don't have to say.
I read the Patrick Rothfuss series, which he didn't finish. A number of these authors, they start these interesting world. They start these massive, projects, and then they leave them off. George R. R. Martin also
I was
did that.
about to say, oh boy,
George R. R. Martin.
whoever could you be talking about?
Yeah, he also didn't finish. But I was actually thinking of the Patrick Rothfuss one, which is I think the name of the win. But Brandon Sanderson, a number of these authors are enjoyable to read for sure.
I have not. I haven't read any Sanderson, but every once in a while, when I'm just on YouTube watching shorts instead of doing other things, his stuff will come up of him talking about writing, and I like his what it seems to be his philosophy on writing. And the guy seems to just he seems to be really prolific, like a machine, just churning out work. Okay, yeah, I just
That's the
figured
key.
I'd
That's
ask.
the key is to find an author that keeps going and gets the series done. Because
Yeah.
uh, with George R. R. Martin and with Patrick Rothfuss, the hardcore fans have truly been let down. I guess.
Oh, but he's still working on it. He
Oh yeah,
insists.
exactly.
Okay, okay. Before we spiral out of control, David DeYoung. Unless you have anything else for us, I'm going to call this one good.
Well, thanks for your interest in my work. And was happy that you reached out, and I'm happy that the title Anti-Eschatological, I guess, caught your eye. So it's been enjoyable chatting with you.
Yeah, thanks for sitting down, man. Take care.
Have a good one.
Thanks so much for listening. Again, there are several ways that you can support the podcast, help us get those numbers up. Subscribe wherever it is that you like to listen to podcasts. But yeah, Patreon for $5 a month. Don't take that option off the table. As we're approaching 100 episodes here, I feel like there's plenty of material now for me to say, yeah, $5 a month, getting access to the whole catalog, and I'm slowly working on putting the video up over there. Yeah, this, I don't know if you could tell, but I'm kind of in awe of a thesis like what this article proposes, which I think there's a kind of religious and pop culture overlap with certain theological notions, and that's to be expected. If you're in the culture will adopt portions of what you're saying, and then they just become standard. They become part of the cultural template, and messianic identity is one of those things. And it seems to me, whether we're talking about explicitly religious communities or not, we tend to cast back the form that an idea has taken into our understanding of how it may have presented itself in the past. And messianic identity is one of those things. Eschatology is one of those things. And I think the idea that everyone was looking forward in the way that we think of forward, or that they were even looking forward at all, that isn't an idea that exists in a unique way to us in our culture, it may blind us to something that may be beneath the text. So yeah, I don't know what I can't say for sure what the academic reception of this argument will be. I think time will tell. I know in the future, if I get to attend, conferences like Society of Biblical Literature or AAR SBL, I may get to find out. There may be people presenting papers that tweak this, disagree with this, or or just outright accept this and incorporate it into a larger body of work. I'm here to find out what that is, and to have my horizons broadened, and I hope that I'm doing the same for you, the listener or the viewer, hopefully. So, yeah, I will be looking for ways to continue engaging with scholars like David DeJong and the work that they're doing, and yeah, trying to learn more. That said, next week on the podcast, Sarah Emanuel, I don't know if maybe I talk about trauma. So I don't know if maybe in addition to, I'm pretty sure I talk more about journal articles than any other biblical studies podcast. I could be wrong, but I think I do proportionately. I think I might also talk about trauma more than anybody else, starting with Alexiana Fry all the way back in the day. And this one with Sarah Emanuel on her book, Trauma Theory, Trauma Story, is not even the last one in what we have to come. 2 weeks from this episode coming out, or 3 weeks after the conversation with Sarah Emanuel comes out, conversation with Brad Kelly on an article that he wrote in the Journal of Biblical Literature, is Hosea among the traumatized? I hope it doesn't seem like I'm fixated on trauma, but it does seem to be an important heuristic, maybe. It is something that I think we need to do a better job of discussing, and it may seem like we run the risk of over discussing it and turning it into a cliche. But the more I'm learning about myself, I'm finding that, trauma is a pretty important part of human identity at an individual and a communal level. So that said, here is a preview of my conversation with Sarah Emanuel, which will be available next week. If you're listening for free, you can already hear this for $5 a month on Patreon. Okay, if you get a chance to love someone, you should take it. Bye.
So one might not call an event traumatic, or even think of an event with the word trauma in mind, or even potentially remember in detail an event. But if they are experiencing some kind of suffering, some kind of disconnect of self-state, some kind of anxiety, hypervigilance, re-experiencing of something that they're not quite sure what it is, but something is happening, those effects or those symptoms will shine through in the way one operates in the world and in the way one tells a narrative. And even beyond that, I think our whole life stories contribute to how we view the world and how we relate to one another and how we narrativize our surroundings.